In 3 minutes, I'll tell you about the night I chose treason over duty and why I'd do it again. I'm Sarah, a Union nurse who broke the most sacred rule of wartime medicine. It was after the Battle of Gettysburg, and our field hospital was chaos incarnate. Blood-soaked floors, men crying for their mothers, the endless stench of gangrene and despair. Then I heard it, a whispered plea from a Confederate soldier everyone else had written off. "Please, miss, just water." My hands shook as I reached for the canteen, knowing that single act of mercy could cost me my life. But mercy doesn't recognize uniforms. You want to know what they don't tell you about being a Union nurse? The rulebook was thinner than a communion wafer, but the unspoken laws could get you hanged. I learned this on my 3rd day at the field hospital outside Gettysburg, when Nurse Catherine Morrison pulled me aside and whispered the real rules. Union soldiers first, always. Confederate wounded only after every Union man was stabilized. Only if supplies remained. Only if no one was watching too closely. The official military protocols were simple enough on paper. Treat your own boys, keep them alive, send them back to fight another day. But what happens when you're staring at a dying Confederate officer who reminds you of your neighbor back home and the morphine meant for Union soldiers sits inches from your trembling hands? What happens when that enemy soldier has the same gap-toothed smile as your cousin Thomas, the same freckled hands as your brother James? I learned these invisible boundaries the hard way, watching other nurses navigate the razor's edge between duty and humanity. There was Martha Collins, who'd been nursing since the war began, her movements precise and cold whenever she passed Confederate wounded. She'd taught me to change bandages and mix laudanum, but she'd also taught me to count morphine vials twice and never write down more than absolutely necessary. There was Elizabeth Warren, barely 22, who'd started the war believing she could save everyone. By Gettysburg, she walked past Confederate soldiers without seeing them, her eyes trained on blue uniforms only. The punishment for aiding enemy combatants wasn't just dismissal. It was treason charges, and treason meant a rope around your neck. I'd grown up hearing stories of Benedict Arnold, but I'd never imagined that giving water to a dying man could make you a traitor. The military didn't distinguish between passing secrets to the enemy and passing comfort to the wounded. Aid was aid, and aid to Confederates was betrayal. Every experienced nurse knew the stories of women who'd vanished after showing too much mercy to the wrong uniform. There was Rebecca Hayes from Pennsylvania, who'd been caught sharing her personal rations with Confederate prisoners. One day she was changing bandages. The next day her tent was empty, her belongings packed away like she'd never existed. Nurse Margaret Flynn from Ohio had been reassigned to a hospital in Washington after someone reported her for spending too much time with Confederate wounded. She'd written letters to her sister describing the transfer as punishment, but the letters stopped coming after 3 weeks. The fear was constant, sitting in your stomach like spoiled meat. You'd check over your shoulder before approaching a Confederate soldier, count the Union wounded twice to make sure you'd seen them all first, measure every dose of medicine like your life depended on it. Because maybe it did. I watched nurses lie about supply counts, marking Confederate treatments as Union treatments in their logs. I watched them falsify death certificates, listing Confederate soldiers as unknown Union dead to avoid questions about resources spent. Yet here I was, 3 days into the aftermath of Gettysburg, staring at regulations that felt written by men who'd never held a dying stranger's hand. The battlefield had been cleared, but our hospital tents were still packed with wounded from both sides. The smell of infection and death clung to everything, and the sounds of pain transcended uniform colors. A Confederate soldier's scream sounded exactly like a Union soldier's scream. Their blood was the same red, their tears the same salt. The weight of that Confederate soldier's whispered plea pressed against every rule I'd sworn to follow. His name was written in blood across a letter in his breast pocket, but I wasn't supposed to read it. His wound was treatable with supplies I had in my apron, but I wasn't supposed to use them. His age was written in the lines of his face and the rough beard with subtle grays, but I wasn't supposed to care that he looked exactly like my neighbor back home. I'd been trained to follow orders without question, to trust that the men who wrote the regulations understood things I couldn't. But standing there in that tent, watching a man die because of the color of his uniform, those regulations felt like chains around my conscience. The Union cause was just, I believed that. Slavery was wrong. The nation needed to be preserved. But did that mean letting a man die when I had the power to save him? The other nurses had learned to compartmentalize, to see Confederate soldiers as abstractions rather than individuals. They'd trained themselves to notice uniform colors before faces, to count enemy wounded as numbers rather than names. But I couldn't seem to learn that skill. Every Confederate soldier reminded me of someone from home, someone's son or brother or husband. The war had taught me to hate in theory, but mercy kept interfering with practice. I thought about my own brother, James, fighting somewhere with the Massachusetts infantry. If he fell wounded behind enemy lines, would I want a Confederate nurse to follow regulations, or would I want her to see him as someone's beloved boy? The answer terrified me because it meant I already knew what I was going to do. The punishment for a Union nurse caught helping Confederate soldiers was court-martial for treason, potential execution, and immediate dismissal from service. I'd heard the charges read aloud at morning assembly, seen the fear in other nurses' eyes as they absorbed the reality of their situation. Treason was a hanging offense, and the military had already made examples of soldiers who'd shown mercy to the enemy. Why would they treat nurses any differently? But knowing the consequences and living with them are two different kinds of hell entirely. I could memorize every regulation, repeat every threat, understand every rational reason to let Confederate soldiers die. But I couldn't unknow the sound of that man's voice saying, "Please." I couldn't unsee the way his hand shook as he reached for water. I couldn't unfeel the way my heart broke when I realized that mercy and duty were about to become enemies, and I was going to have to choose between them. The regulations were clear, the consequences were real, and the choice was mine. In a few hours, I'd discover which was stronger, my fear of death or my fear of becoming someone who could walk past suffering without stopping. Some decisions remake you entirely, and there's no going back to who you were before the moment arrives. Stay tuned for part 2 of this series by subscribing and hitting the notification bell.